Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Let's see, we'll give folks a few moments to get connected into audio and everything. So for those that have joined us, welcome to Financial and Legal Strategies in the New Normal Part 2. We're just waiting for folks to get logged in and connected up to audio and everything. Hope everyone's doing well today.
Good morning, Tommy.
Good morning.
Rollin. Morning, Jamie.
Thank you all for being here. Right, we've got about 24 so far. Give it just another minute. Well, good morning, everyone. We've had quite a few register for the webinar this morning. So we're just going to give it just another minute or two. We've got about 25 logged in already with a little over 60 registered. So we'll give it another minute or so.
Tommy, did you notice that question up there about accessing the last seminar? Yeah, you're muted, Tommy.
Yeah, great question. Thanks so much. So the last seminar, part 1, is up on our COVID-19 resource page. So if you go to the landing page for the chamber, ashevillechamber.org, and our COVID-19 resource page, all of those, that webinar is accessed there. And I'm happy to share that too. If you want to send me your email address, I'm happy to get that link over to you. And I'm happy to share my email address in the chat if you want to just send it after the webinar today. All right, so we are at 5 after 10. Welcome to Financial and Legal Strategies in the New Normal Part 2. My name is Tommy Dennison. I'm the Director of Member Development here at the Asheville Chamber. Welcome, it's great to have you all here today. I'm going to take a few moments to introduce our panelists this morning. First up is Rollin Groseclose. He's the Vice President of Tax Services at Johnson Price Sprinkle. Thank you for being here, Rollin. And he's responsible for coordinating the firm's tax services for clients, both business and individual. He has significant expertise in the areas of tax and business advisory services and focuses his energies on manufacturing and distribution, construction and real estate development, and hospitality. The two gentlemen from Allen Stahl and Kilbourne, first up is Derek Allen. He's a leader in the alcohol beverage law, real estate development, and zoning and land use. He has extensive experience with craft breweries, ranging in size from small startups to those with national distribution. And his practice includes representation of craft breweries, wineries, and distilleries in a wide range of permitting, regulatory, and trade issues. Last but not least is Jamie Kilbourne. He's a litigation attorney with 22 years of experience in all aspects of civil litigation, including depositions, hearings, mediations, arbitrations, jury trials, and appeals. He primarily handles the firm's complex litigation, construction litigation, and appeals. And Jamie is also a certified mediator. Jamie, Derek, welcome this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome, Rollin. We've got a really, really great program planned for you today, so we're going to jump right in. Rollin, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, Rollin's going to cover some of the updates that have happened since last time, as will Derek and Jamie, of course, regarding PP loans and the stimulus package.
Thanks, Tommy. Appreciate the introduction, and appreciate all of you that are able to join us. It wouldn't be much of a financial discussion in this time frame if we didn't talk about PPP loans. That was certainly a big topic of our last discussion, on the minds of many of our clients and certainly a lot of the chamber members as well. And so we're going to spend a good bit of our time, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the status. So things have changed a lot. You've probably seen a lot in the news, a lot of updates, maybe some from our firm or from other firms in town that speak about this program because it has had such a significant impact. $649 billion program. And of course, the big advantage of this program is these are forgivable loans. I can't think of any time in history or my experience in practice where someone makes a loan and at the outset plans on forgiving it. But that's what we have here, a pretty incredible program. As of the tail end of last week, coming into this week, about 520 billion of those funds had already been approved. I understand that there's about another 30 billion or so on top of that that's pending. So we're down to 90 billion or a little less than that still left in the program. The borrowing rate has dropped off tremendously, and a significant part of that is because folks could only go and borrow once. Once you made your first stab and borrowed the most that you could, that was it. You couldn't go back and borrow another round. So that's the reason things have tapered off a lot. Average loan size, just considering the overall number of loans, is about 104,000. So that's kind of interesting for us to consider as well. Right now, the program is slated to end by August 8th. That means if you haven't applied for a loan already, you have until August 8th to make that application, and then the processing that happens after that. After that, that window will be closed. And we'll talk about the possibility of a re-up or extension of this program later on. The SBA, I know many of you that have gotten those loans are wondering, when can I submit an application? Right now, the SBA is saying that they will start accepting applications on August 10th. And then parenthetically, we're all saying maybe. It depends on if they decide to change any of the rules anymore between now and then. But as of now, we have to sit tight for another 12 days or so before that application can be submitted. Many of you have already reached the end of your either 8-week period, or if you've taken a longer period, you've spent or gotten close to spending all the money, and so are chomping at the bit to kind of get that behind you and find out for sure what's going to be forgiven. You just have to sit tight just a little bit longer. We'll talk about the process of getting ready for that, getting all your ducks in a row, getting all your documents together. And then if you didn't notice, the SBA and Treasury decided to release the names of all the loan applicants, or those that received loans of over $150,000. So if you got a loan of over $150,000, your name's out there and available essentially to be for folks to know. I think there was a lot of scrutiny around this program, a lot of concerns of abuse. We're continuing to see arrests related to fraudulent claims, but I think part of the effort of Treasury was just to add some transparency to the whole program. So what's changed? And this is really kind of going back to our last session, as well as maybe in the last, we really haven't had much in the way of changes in the last month. Most of the changes that were happening almost weekly for a while slowed down a lot near the end of June. But so we now have a covered period. This is the time that you have essentially to spend the funds that goes up to 24 weeks. And I say up to because you don't have to wait the full 24 weeks before saying, okay, I've spent all the money, I'm ready to apply for forgiveness. So initially it was 8 weeks, now we're up to 24. The portion of the loan that can be forgiven was initially set with a minimum threshold of 75% for payroll. In other words, at least 75% of the funds had to be spent on payroll, or some of the forgiveness was going to be compromised. You'd be stuck with a loan at the end of it. That threshold has been dropped to 60%. So that means 40% can be spent on other things, qualifying utilities, rent, mortgage interest, those sorts of things. Another change, we had a June 30 date. That was a pretty significant date. And obviously we're well past that now. And I think the government realized that wasn't going to be enough time for folks to be able to recover. So for now, anyway, they've moved that back to 12/31. Of course, there's still question about what things will look like by the end of this year. But basically, if you're facing reductions to the amount that you can get forgiven because your full-time equivalent, that's the FTE headcount, has been reduced, or you've been forced to lower how much you're paying individual employees by over 25%, then you've got until 12/31 to kind of restore things to what you had before COVID. So that's a big relief. That added another 6 months to the ability to kind of avoid having your loan forgiveness reduced. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. A couple other things. In the past, we talked about a $15,000 cap on how much of an employee's compensation you could count in the payroll costs. So that was based on 8 weeks. So now if we look at a 24-week period, the maximum for non-owner compensation is $46,154. That's just the math. $100,000 maximum broken down to a 24-week period. That would equate to $46,000. We also got more clarity, or actually additional restrictions around owner compensation. The first one is we got to look back at last year. You can't count more than you paid yourself last year. That means as an owner, if you weren't paid at all last year, maybe one of you was paid but your spouse wasn't paid, paying yourself suddenly in 2020 for the purpose of maximizing your PPP loan won't work. It's based on the lower of what you paid yourself last year, or a cap that's based on that $100,000 threshold, and it works out for owners to $20,833. I know the math is different. 20,000 is not the same as 46,000. There's reasoning mathematically behind that, but just know that if you're planning on counting more than $20,000, you need to plan on finding that money somewhere else, spending that money somewhere else, so that you can maximize your forgiveness. This is just a quick visual, kind of goes back to the overall concept of this program. We start with the overall loan amount. Of course, you can't get forgiveness for more than what you initially borrowed, but that amount of forgiveness can be reduced by how much you spend. So you got to spend everything to have a chance of getting everything forgiven. And then you have two other things that could play in and reduce the amount of forgiveness, and that's your head count, full-time equivalent head count. And then if you've made pay reductions of more than 25% just to try to make it through, the government feels like if they're going to subsidize and give you a forgivable loan, you shouldn't be reducing everyone's pay and potentially pocketing some of that or directing that money somewhere else. They want you to use the money they're providing to keep people fully paid and keep people fully employed. That's the idea behind the program. And again, we'll talk about some key exceptions to those last two reductions there, especially the head count. So yeah, right on cue. If we look at the full-time equivalent headcount. So you might recall before, if you reduced your headcount post-COVID, so basically the line in the sand is February 15. If you reduced your headcount after that, then you have actually until December 31st to restore that headcount. So let's say you started out the year with 50 employees, and then COVID hit, and either you were forced to shut down, or people stopped coming and visiting your business as much, or whatever, and you had to drop, let's say, down to 30 employees. You have until December 31st to bring that headcount back up to 50 in order to avoid this reduction in your loan forgiveness. So what if you want to apply before December 31st? You're allowed to, that's fine, but just know that if you apply early, it's the headcount when you apply. So that's one reason not to apply too early. If you're on the fence or not quite sure, or you work through the application and it looks like you might get dinged for a reduction in your headcount, you probably want to wait a little while. 24 weeks is a long period. It'd be nice to know what's going to be forgiven, but I think it's probably even better to know for sure that it will be forgiven and that you've gotten the maximum. So don't apply. The lesson there is don't apply too early. Make sure that you're solid on your FTE headcount. A couple of other exceptions to this reduction in forgiveness. If you were unable to rehire employees that were laid off for some reason, or to find qualified replacement employees, you just couldn't find people didn't want to come to work, or they just weren't available, whatever the case might be, there's an exception for that. That's going to apply to a lot of folks. I think of the restaurant industry, for example. You've been unable to operate in many respects because of the different federal and North Carolina and county restrictions. So this would be a big relief to you that you won't get your loan forgiveness reduced simply because your headcount's down. Could not get employees to return full-time. There is documentation required for this. You got to be able to show that you made an offer. You got to have a written offer. It can be by email, but it needs to be a written offer that you can document, because the applications are going to require documentation if you're going to try to claim these exceptions. If you couldn't get employees to return to full-time, so you're able to keep somebody, maybe they were full-time, they dropped to part-time, you want them to come back full-time, and they're not comfortable, either because of a home situation, maybe they got kids at home, or their spouse is working full-time, or any number of situations. If you can't get them to come back full-time, document that. That can also be an exception for you. And then two other exceptions: if you fired somebody for cause, that's not always something that we wind up doing in North Carolina as just based on the North Carolina employment law. But if there is a fired for cause, that gives you an exception as well. So basically you don't have to reduce your head count if you fired somebody for cause. You get to still count them. Or if the employee themselves voluntarily resigned or voluntarily reduced their hours. If you remember, full-time equivalent is tabulated based on a 40-hour threshold. So if somebody is working 20 hours, that's half of an employee. And so it takes two of those to count to one full head count. So if they've reduced their hours, that could come into play and potentially reduce your loan forgiveness, but this is an exception if an employee has done this on their own accord. And if we talk about what might be left, so one thing I like to remind folks of: if you applied for an economic injury disaster loan advance, this was the $1,000 per employee up to a $10,000 total. That applies against the amount that you can have forgiven on your PPP loan. So let's say you got $150,000 PPP and you spent all the money and you've done everything and you are sure you're going to get 100% forgiveness, but you got this $10,000 advance. Your PPP loan balance is going to be $10,000. You're going to be stuck with that as a loan. And what's your option? I mean, probably if it was me, if you weren't really backed into a corner and had to keep it, you might just want to repay it. But the interest is cheap. It's 1%. And the third bullet down there, the other thing that they did as a change is, instead of this being a 2-year loan, it's now a 5-year loan. Typically that's just worked out with a bank, but it's extended to a 5-year loan. So, I mean, if it's meaningful and helpful to stretch that $10,000 out, that's certainly something you can do. Keep in mind that forgiveness and approval could take several weeks. The SBA has committed to lenders a time frame in which they will respond. The lenders have so long to submit the paperwork and get that in as well, but it could take several weeks to actually get the official notice of approval. Once you've gotten that approval and you know the amount that's forgiven, whatever's left, you have 6 months from that point before your first payment's due. So you still got plenty of time before that first payment becomes due. Interest does accrue in the meantime, but again, it's only at a rate of 1%. Talk just a bit about the applications themselves. So we have 2 applications, and this is maybe not surprising to those of you that work with the government on a regular basis, but in order to get things to be easy, we have to jump through a number of hoops and meet a number of qualifications. Otherwise, you're stuck with something that's a little bit harder, the long form. So the easy form, and on the next slide, I'll give you a link that you can go to find the forms themselves, because I think it's helpful to look at them if you haven't. The easy form, you're eligible to do this if you meet one of 2 criteria. The first one, if you were self-employed and have not and don't currently during the covered period have any employees. So it's just you, independent contractor, self-employed, gig worker, whatever the situation might be. If it's just you, you're in business for yourself, you're eligible to use that easy form. The other one is a little bit more complicated, and it's because if there are reductions in your head count, you're trying to claim any of those exceptions we talked about, or if there are reductions in your pay or anything along those lines, if you're looking for one of those safe harbors, you've got to use the long form. But if you don't have any of those issues, so if you didn't reduce your compensation for your employees, any individual employee, by more than 25%, and the base measure is first quarter. So January through March 31st is your kind of baseline. If you've kept paying folks at the same level that they were paid before, or only dropped them by say 10, 15, 20%, that's the first condition. And you either didn't reduce any of your headcount, your employees, or your hours. If that doesn't apply, then you can still meet it if you were unable to operate at pre-COVID levels. So I think, again, of restaurants or hotels, you've clearly been unable to operate at pre-COVID levels by a matter of law because of a variety of restrictions. As long as you also didn't reduce any individual's compensation by more than 25%, you can use this easy form. I'll just say, I think it's probably self-explanatory, but the easy form is the way to go if you can. It is simpler. We're talking about, a lot less in paperwork, also a lot less in documentation. So that's the way that you want to go if you can do it. The criteria, there are instructions for each of these forms, and the criteria for the easy form is also spelled out in those instructions as clearly as it can be. It takes about 3/4 of a page to explain these exceptions, but take a look at those. That's the way to go. I think this is the best resource that we have if you really want to look in and dive into some of the particulars. Honestly, even though SBA is administering this, hopefully nobody's offended at this, but I think their website's pretty difficult to work with. It's hard to follow. I don't find it as accurate and not as complete. Things are harder to find, so I go to Treasury. If you go to home.treasury.gov, right at the top of their page, they've got this red banner that refers to the Paycheck Protection Loans. You click there and there's an entire page committed to PPP. There's a little bit on EIDLs there as well. And there's a whole section for borrowers. And in there you'll find the long form application, the easy form application, and the instructions, as well as a number of other things. And it's, whether or not it's easy to read is subjective, but it is designed for borrowers reading. There's a whole lender section that gets more complicated that isn't really probably that relevant for you. Tommy, I'm going to stop there just a minute. Do we have some PPP specific questions before I move on to talking about whether or not we have some more stimulus?
Yes, we sure do, Rollin. Thanks so much. So we had a couple great questions come in specifically to your presentation, and going back to the piece on the 8 weeks versus 24. The first question was, what are your thoughts on whether a business should choose 8 weeks versus 24 weeks? And thoughts on whether to apply for forgiveness early other than reductions in payroll or employees?
So first, the 8 week versus 24 week question. I would lean, if you're clearly have spent everything, if you feel really confident that you spent everything in the 8-week period, there's no, you're plenty in the black in terms of having met all the requirements. I would tend to go towards that because there's less documentation. There's less of a time period to be covered. There's less of a time period that could possibly be questioned. Banks have a set of criteria from the SBA on what they should be looking for, what they're required to get. But also banks have the opportunity, being kind of in the middle between the SBA and the borrower, to set some of their own expectations or requirements. And we've seen that with some banks asking for some additional things just to have that doctored up. If they want to ensure that the SBA is going to guarantee and stand behind this loan, they want their own ducks in a row. The lenders do as well. So, I would check with the bank and find out for sure exactly what they're going to expect or require. I think most of the banks have released at least a preliminary guide on that, knowing that things could change a little bit between now and August 10th. But I would go for the 8-week. If you're clearly in there and it's covered, I'd go for the 8-week. I don't see a downside to doing that if you've met the requirements for full forgiveness. If you're uncertain, or there's some things that you're kind of unclear about or difficult to translate, because despite all the guidance we've had, some things are still kind of gray. I don't necessarily see a harm in doing the 24-week route either. The SBA has essentially said that they feel like the extension to 24 weeks, plus all these additional exceptions that they've made, will nearly guarantee a lot of the hardest hit industries, especially, full forgiveness. That's really what the spirit of the law was. They wanted to be able to make these into grants for those that were hardest hit. And so they feel like the 24 weeks is plenty long. So I'd say if you go for the 24-week period, just to steer clear of any shortfall you might have in the 8-week period. I also don't see any real harm in applying early. To the person that asked that question, they indicated, if there's no issue of reduction in pay or reduction in employees. I don't see any problem with applying early. Of course, you can't before August 10th at this point, but I don't see any problems with doing that. And personally, I would probably plan on doing that. Again, just in case something else tweaks in the rules or the form changes or something later on for whatever reason. It just avoids additional efforts to try to keep up with a moving target. So again, just make sure you're clearly in, maybe have a second set of eyes on it, whether it's internally, if you're the one preparing it, have someone else look over your shoulders, have your accountant, your CPA, even your attorney take a look with you. Hopefully you've got a great relationship with your banker, have them just double check behind you and make sure they're comfortable too before it gets submitted, in hopes of just maximizing the forgiveness.
Excellent. Thank you, Rollin. And you may, I think you've touched on a little bit of this with that last question, but the last one that came through, what if we want to use the 8-week period to base our forgiveness, but wait until week 24, for example, to apply because we are hoping they pass the 150K or less simple application for forgiveness? Can we just select the 8-week period we are applying for, or are we stuck with the whole 24-week period because we waited?
Yes, good question. I don't recall off the top of my head, but I think it's June 5th. If you got a loan before June 5th, you have the option of choosing the 8-week period or the 24-week period. If you got your loan after that date, I think you're essentially forced into the 24-week period. Again, I don't recall that date for certain. I remember it's sometime in June, and I'm thinking it's like June 5th. And so you can wait until the 24-week period essentially and choose to still use the 8-week period. That should be fine.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, that was all the questions we had come in specifically to the PPP, Rollin. If you wanted to move forward with that, with the presentation.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
So, I mean, I'm not going to spend much more time on this, but I wanted to touch on further stimulus. You might have seen that on Monday, the Senate released their suggested second round of stimulus, so what I'm calling the second round of stimulus, the CARES Act being the first large one along these lines. We had the House pass back in May, the HEROES Act. It was a $3 trillion bill or series of bills covered under the HEROES Act, had a whole bunch of stuff in there. The HEALS Act, they took a little bit more streamlined approach, but it's still $1 trillion package. And if nothing else, I mean, no one's really expecting the HEALS Act, the latest act that came out on Monday, to actually pass as it currently stands. It's mainly just putting some paper on the table to talk through. So now both sides of essentially both chambers and the Republican Democratic parties have put their ideas on the table, kind of fleshed out. The House has changed and moderated some of their positions a little bit since May, or redirected their interests. But now this gives both sides an opportunity to kind of flesh out the details. And we see what I would call some meaningful overlap in the two positions or the two sets of bills, particularly as it relates to the PPP. The one thing that seems pretty clear is there's a lot of interest in allowing a second round of borrowing. So the current program only allows you to go to the well once. Once you get your loan, that's it. Even if you left money on the table and didn't know that you could have applied for more, that's it. You're stuck with that one PPP loan. This would allow a second borrowing. Both groups seem to be interested in paring down who can apply. So the threshold in the past was, for the most part, employers of 500 and under. The HEROES and HEALS Act both reduced that number even further, maybe 300 or less. I think the HEROES Act was maybe closer to 100 or maybe even 50 employees. It was a good bit smaller, but maybe we'll meet somewhere in between. The idea, though, is not let everybody that applied the first round apply, but those maybe that are hardest hit. Maybe also looking at a reduction in revenue. So if you've suffered 50% loss in revenues, you might qualify as well. So that would be a big thing. We know a lot of clients, a lot of businesses that would readily welcome another round of forgivable loans and be able to stretch out their existence a little bit longer and hopefully make it through on the back end. The other piece is there's consideration of broadening the non-payroll costs, so utilities and mortgage interest, but maybe just other operating costs. Of just staying afloat. Rents, interest, and utilities are the main ones right now, but maybe there's some other costs just in keeping things afloat that should be considered as well. Beyond the PPP, both of the bills speak to some new and expanded tax credits, and credits that aren't necessarily driven on profitability, right? So because a lot of profitability for many businesses is being compromised because of COVID. So maybe these are refundable credits. In other words, you don't have to have profit or you don't have to have tax to reduce with these credits. You could wind up with zero tax and maybe still actually get some money, effectively a grant from the government if you meet certain criteria. They might be employment related. Most of them are driven towards employment. Individual stimulus checks, we're looking at another round of those. There's talk in both provisions about those, maybe another $1,200 each, possibly lowering the income thresholds from 75 or 150,000, maybe even lower than that, but there's talk of those. And then a tremendous amount, actually, I'd say the most significant parts of these bills actually are in the healthcare arenas, those on the front lines of COVID, schools, local governments, helping them with their unemployment funds, further unemployment assistance, a whole variety of things there that have been put out in these two packages. So I'd say just stay tuned. We're dealing right now with the end of the PPP loan program as it currently stands. We're talking about the end of the unemployment assistance that ends this week. The unemployment assistance that the federal government gave, the $600 per week, that comes to an end. We're coming up on the Democratic and Republican national conventions. So there's a lot of pressure to try to hurry up and get something done before maybe focus is placed elsewhere and before folks run out of options that are helping them in their businesses. So Tommy, that's really all I had as far as a presentation. I'll continue to stay tuned to what Derek and Jamie have and any other questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rollin. Really appreciate it. So yeah, segueing in, Jamie and Derek are here to cover some legal updates, share some scenarios, things that they've seen. So Jamie, Derek, I'll turn it over to you.
Derek, let me go first on the PPP, just one last piece. Obviously, it's still open till August 8th. There are still banks accepting we have a list from last week up on our website. I'll probably update that later this week to see who's dropping off. The fintechs, which are folks like Fountainhead and Cabbage and Lindo and Fundera, seem to be making a real heavy pitch here at the end. They're all still up and running with automated systems. Some people have had success with those, some people haven't. So self-help here in town is accepting for 2 more days. I don't know if there's still time to get through that process for them. I know some of the big banks have gone offline to be able to process all the loans. So, and there are some banks who, sure, go ahead, sir.
I'll throw in Mountain BizWorks as well. They've been promoting that even this week.
Okay, because Mountain BizWorks had said they were no longer accepting last week. So, you know, It's one of those things where if you're in the process with somebody right now, you definitely should carry it out to the end. This is not time to change horses. But just like the first time around, and we've done this twice, I guess now, guys, just like the first time around where the panic starts setting in because the deadline is approaching, if you aren't working with somebody now, you need to get on it immediately. There probably will be something like we saw in the cast about a new program of some sort. We don't know what it's going to be or what the requirements are going to be. So but we do know what the requirements are here, you know, and it's just important. I mean, for the federal government, $80 billion is sort of the change they leave in the couch. So it's not really going to affect the national budget one way or the other about whether or not this money gets sent out, but it may affect individual businesses and their survivability. And I think we've talked about on a couple calls, Derek and I did, that with the expansion of the 24 weeks and with some of the safe harbors created, that we changed our story that we were advising our clients in the food service and in the alcohol industry, that the PPPs look a lot better after the early July than they did in the original permutation for those clients. So I just encourage folks who are concerned about this to get up with their bankers immediately, because folks are going to start dropping out and not taking new applications, and they have to get it processed and in by the end of business on the 8th. So this is not the study that you can cram overnight on the 8th and get it passed. This is something you're going to have to prepare ahead for and make sure that you've got all the documents that you need so that you aren't left holding the bag. Thanks, Tommy.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. And we did have a question come in. A lot of banks are only using 2019 data because they only use an online process. Are you aware of live banks where you can use 2020 data for companies that only began payroll in 2020?
Well, I know of one. I don't know if they're still taking applications. I know First Citizens uses 2020 data. And the reason I know that is because Allen Stahl plus Kilbourne applied using 2020 data. I mean, that's not a secret. It was published that we received a fund. Many of the law firms and many of the businesses here have. So you need to work with your banker. And yeah, a lot of people are using online processes, fintechs, those kind of things. But ultimately, I think this is a return to what every professional would say, is that you have to have a good relationship with your fellow professionals. If you're a business, you need a banker that you have a good relationship with. I had a friend up in Raleigh who actually changed banks over PPP. He's a lawyer in town, and he left a 20-year bank because he was not happy with the relationship with his banker on PPP, and a different bank gave him a better relationship. So, I mean, I think I'm repeating myself from our first meeting. This is where the rubber hits the road. I mean, these are times of crisis, and you have to rely upon your other professionals. The key is, even if they're using an online system, chances are there are human beings, somewhere in the back. Now, I won't say that about the fintechs. I mean, there are probably no human beings involved in that. But at your local bank, whether you're at Truist or First Citizens or PNC, there are human beings still at the bank. And there are always going to be exceptions to the automated system, and they probably have the ability to get around those. But it's going to have to be a personal relationship.
Tommy, the only other thing I'll add to that is that you do have to have been in existence before February 15, 2020.
Okay.
So you can't start late February, have started a business and get a PPP. The current program says you had to be in business on February 15th.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. That's great.
But if you're in business between January 1st and February 15th, then, or if you change the nature of your business, which is sort of a really complicated question we're getting, where, you know, mergers and takeovers and purchases and those kind of things pop up, or maybe you've opened a new outlet and now you have, you know, 5 different restaurants instead of just one that you opened on January 1st. You know, the PPP applies to those sorts of things as long as it's before the crisis, as long as it happened before February 15th. You can't make up new businesses that you want a PPP loan on that didn't exist before the crisis.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you both for the clarification. Great points, definitely. Derek, we'll turn it over to you. I know you and Jamie both have been hearing a lot of working on a lot of different scenarios and wanted to share those today. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And I've got this big note to myself for disclaimer, and especially as we answer questions here, both for Rollin and for our firm, we're not giving legal advice or accounting advice. We're just generally analyzing these. So no relationships of a professional nature are being formed here while we go through this. I thought what I'd do, Tommy, is just kind of talk through the things that we get on a day-to-day basis. There's not a single day that goes by in any given week right now that we're not answering some question on how we're applying in this new economy. And you know, we've gone through the PPP, and we've mentioned briefly EIDL loans. So application of those funds, how we use them, et cetera. You know, we do that every single day. Something that is happening now, though, is, you know, the folks that have survived this are looking for ways to thrive in this new economy. And in doing that, I do a lot of work in the real estate sector and commercial real estate and development. You know, those folks are moving forward with permitting and trying to see what's going to happen on the backside. There are real buying opportunities in that commercial real estate sector as folks have gotten beat up and holding on to properties. I do a lot of work in the food and bev industry. As those have come back online in limited capacities, we've had to figure out ways to make sure they can open safely and open economically. And that's dealt with almost in every instance, some dealing with landlord-tenant issues, those commercial leases. And so every day we're getting a call from someone either on the landlord side or the tenant side dealing with a commercial lease operation and application and what they're going to do about it collectively, as both parties. And so we look at force majeure clauses and impossibility and frustration of purpose and try to come up with something that's practical and pragmatic for both of those parties to make sure that they can thrive, because a commercial landlord is in no better position than the tenant if you end up with a dark space. We get employee issues, again, literally every day, and Rollin forecasted some of those issues. You have employees who won't come back to work for whatever reason, or can't come back to work for whatever reason, or they'll come back and they won't comply with the governor's executive order. And so we're dealing with those issues and making sure that these operating entities are staying inside those safe harbor spaces. I'm getting questions of, I would say, a creative nature, where people try to interpret the executive order in a way that allows them to open up their particular business that might not be able to open, or open in a way that is more aggressive than a literal reading of the executive order would allow for. And we try to counsel them against that, and we talk about what that might mean in terms of voiding their insurance coverage if they're found to have violated an executive order. We talk about things like negligence per se, and that if you violate that executive order and someone gets sick, there's an argument that person doesn't even have to prove that they got sick at your place. Same for employees. We've been doing a lot of drafting of waivers for those entities that are dealing with the public and having folks come in and use their facilities for whatever it might be, or they've got a outdoor operation that's renting mountain bikes or kayaks or tubes, and putting in new COVID and Corona language into their waiver indemnification agreements. And just kind of a forecast of what comes next. The thing that I've seen that's maybe to me the most interesting is what I've been calling an acceleration of the inevitable. So I think this happens anytime you have these log jams of law and policy and public crises, whether it was 2007 to 2009 period or now, things that were already happening are going to be accelerated. So we're in a time and place where folks have started to go and live where they want to be, and jobs have to find them. And so the traditional office space has been gradually going away over the last couple of years. We've just accelerated that by 5 years. When we come out of this thing, office space as we know it will no longer exist. There will be hundreds of thousands of jobs that would not be in an office anymore that used to be. And those businesses will find that that's probably profitable. The real estate sector is obviously going to get hit pretty hard with that, particularly as we look at downtown and urban centers. We're already seeing the impacts of what that means for our economy. While right now commercial real estate is really down or headed that way in Asheville, North Carolina, our residential prices, I will say, are ticking upwards because you've got folks fleeing urban centers and coming down to where they want to be, where they can mountain bike and walk on trails and get on the river and telecommute. And so you're seeing those home prices go up. You're seeing multifamily, bang right now in that sector. So that acceleration of the inevitable is what you're seeing now, and the folks that are learning and maneuvering in that space are going to do well no matter what economic sector they're in.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. Greatly appreciate the insight and sharing that with us. We are right at the 10:45 mark, and which is a great segue. We had a lot of great questions come in ahead of time, both legal and CPA focused as well. I'll ask this to Derek and Jamie. We got this one ahead of time. One of our attendees today is a travel advisor, and they asked legally, how will they need to present COVID-19 warnings to their clients?
Well, it starts with the general advice that we give everyone, which is, making sure that anytime you're dealing with the public, you're following the existing executive order to a T in your place. In terms of forewarning where folks might be going, I think that you would come up with, one, have waiver language inside of your documents with anything they're signing with you that says that they are alert of where they're going, they understand what the local rules are in the place that they're going. Go out of your way to make them aware and make them understand what those are, and have them acknowledge that back to you. Right now, whether you're dealing with forgiveness on PPP or compliance with the executive order on your place of business, documenting what you're doing and being able to prove that you did it is going to be important in terms of risk mitigation. And a year from now, you don't want to have to go back and look for those things. You wanted to know that they were there because that was your routine operating procedure.
So from specifically to a travel agency, I mean, this creates some really interesting issues. First and foremost, you're delivering people to some other place, and they're paying you for the service and the knowledge you have. So I think the key would be to be aware not just of the restrictions and the requirements, but be aware of the trends and the things that are happening in the place you're sending folks. And they're going to be looking to you for guidance of, is it too dangerous to go to Glacier National Park this month? Glacier looked amazing in May. I actually thought about driving up there during my vacation. Glacier doesn't look so amazing anymore because of the very fact that other people like me decided they wanted to go to Glacier in June. Those sort of issues are going to play out over and over. And then, of course, you have the international restrictions. I came up with a list of, I think, about 35 countries where you can travel to right now. I looked at one of those Turks and Caicos, for example, which had almost no infections while they were closed. But guess what's happened now that they've reopened their airports? So, what do you do in a situation like that as a travel advisor? You buy insurance. I mean, I think it's almost a must to have, healthcare insurance, medical insurance, transportation insurance, because the catch is if you catch COVID in the Turks and Caicos, there is no way you can board a commercial flight to return to the United States. No matter how much kind of care you're going to need, there will not be a commercial plane seat available to you because you're going to fail the temperature test and they're going to leave you at the airport. So, I mean, just not to give specific advice to a travel agent, but this is a microcosm of what we have. is that right now, medical transportation insurance seems like a must if you're going to go anywhere, because there's no other way to get back. And I think that's a microcosm of everything we're seeing, which is, as Derek said, everything that was here before is amplified now. All the risk, all the dangers, all the issues are amplified. So you have to, in a risk adverse environment, the best thing you have is knowledge. And so you accumulate as much knowledge as possible. You pass that on to your clients. I mean, that's what we're on this call doing, is we're passing our knowledge on to our clients. And you have to make then, as a business owner, a reasoned guess based upon the advice you're getting. And that's what everybody's doing now.
Yeah.
And the advice we give today will not be the same as the advice we'll give next week, because the conditions are changing so quickly.
Yeah, and kind of the cocktail that on any kind of application is awareness of the rules, compliance with the rules, get a waiver that whoever you're dealing with is acknowledging that, and then have insurance as well in case all that fails.
Yeah, great points. Thank you both.
And then have a good lawyer and accountant in case the insurance doesn't work out well.
Right. Great point. All right, so Rollin, we'll get this one to you. We had a couple of very similar questions around tax strategies. And this one, I think, kind of covers both that we got ahead of time. But what tax strategies should they be employing if their business happens to be having a very successful year, as their company is benefiting from COVID-19? May not be the typical experience that others, because we did have a second kind of question in that same realm, just around tax strategies for this year for their business in general. So kind of 2 points there, business having a great year, and then of course, other businesses employing tax strategies as well for 2020.
Okay. Yeah, that's all the more complicated. Tax planning and positioning can be a complicated thing anyway, but in this environment, it's even more complicated, especially not knowing what's ahead. What maybe was somewhat predictable before is not now. And so, I mean, one thing that I think is really important that we can't underestimate is be informed, and do your reading. And I don't want to throw our own group under the bus as CPAs, but we only know as much as we've studied ourselves, but also we don't necessarily know what's going on in your business if we don't have ongoing dialogue and discussions. So your assumption might be, well, I sent you my QuickBooks. Don't you know that that's what's going on? Well, it depends on what you asked us to look into, the whole variety of things we may or may not. Let's have conversations about that. And so if there are changes in your business, like if you are doing really well, and we may or may not have guessed that that's the case as your outside advisors, but having conversations around that, stay informed, do your reading, understand the opportunities. You don't have to understand the intricacies of how certain opportunities work, but hey, I read such and such, can that apply to me? I mean, I love it when I get those kind of questions. I'd rather bring it up myself, but sometimes I don't even know that that's going on, or just don't think of that particular situation and how it might work out in the individual client situation. So I'd say be informed. We still have a massive tax bill or tax law that came in at the end of 17 that kicked in 18, which is having dramatic effect through 18, 19, and 20, and maybe beyond in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Take a minute and go back and read through some of those key provisions. For the most part, tax planning in the last number of years has shifted to tax deferral, putting off the inevitable, putting it off, to later on or the next generation. But there are some opportunities to just outright avoid or certainly reduce the tax bite altogether. So you just don't want to miss out on those opportunities. Some things that we see regularly is optimizing depreciation. I mean, that's a common one that people are aware of, but it's gotten a lot more complicated in the last few years. If you're spending money on rolling stock, trucks and equipment and furniture and fixtures and things like that, there's a variety of options and variations of those options that we can use to maximize the benefit. We also have the CARES Act, that put in some new or expanded tax credits. And the talk in these new stimulus bills also talks about tweaking those or modifying those. So you want to be aware of what those things are so that you can take advantage of those as well. Tax credits are one of the best ones. There aren't a ton of them out there that have big impact, but I would say R&D credit is one that we see overlooked very readily. It's not white lab coats. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. If you're, a brewery, if you're manufacturing widgets, anything, machine shop, if you're doing any sort of blending, so even in the food industry, we've got folks in town that are making foods, a variety of things. You think about those, there is R&D going on. There's an unknown that you have to solve for and figure out how to make it taste right, how to make it last on the shelf, things like that. So that's just an example. R&D credit we see overlooked again and again as an opportunity. And there are a whole number of those. So I'd say nothing can surpass awareness of what the opportunities are, and just bring it up. Ask your counsel whether or not this could apply and if you're taking full advantage of it.
Rollin, one thing we probably ought to talk about is IRS Notice 2020-32, the IRS's attempt to reverse Congress. The PPP obviously declares that the PPP loan forgiveness is excluded from gross income for tax purposes.
Yeah.
The IRS, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that while that is obviously the law, they are going to exclude all expenses paid with PPP money from deductible expenses. So,
same end result.
Same end result. Whether you take from the left hand or you take from the right, you end up with a tax bill. So one of the things, right, that folks are going to face is if you took a $200,000 PPP loan and get full forgiveness, you're going to have a $200,000 profit this year, even though you may have used that money to stay open. You're still going to realize a profit much higher than your ordinary operations would allow.
Yeah, that's a great point, and certainly one worth reminding folks of, or letting them know about if they haven't heard that. That is the IRS's position right now. North Carolina's followed suit in saying even if IRS changes their mind, our law is going to be, we're not going to allow those deductions. So again, in your example, 200,000. Let's say you had a $200,000 loan, and at the end of the year you break even. $200,000 of forgivable PPP loan, those expenses that you paid to get forgiveness are not deductible. So suddenly break even means $200,000 of taxable income because you have a non-deductible expense. So that's something to certainly keep in mind. So if you're doing planning, and let's say you have been able to hold your own or maybe even do very well during this time despite what we're going through, you don't want to start planning on what those savings, what this windfall, so to speak, did for you. You don't want to plan on just deploying all of that into something that that's not going to be liquid, like buying a bunch of equipment or something like that. You want to consider that there is a tax impact. So you want to hold back, 25, 30, 35, 40%. And I'd say at least until this is resolved, Congress has made it pretty clear. Several of the senior officials in Congress have indicated that's not what we intended. That's not what we wanted. So I expect, and I'm very hopeful, that in whatever final second round of stimulus get, or maybe shortly thereafter, certainly by year end, before taxes start coming to bear, is that Congress will override the IRS and say, no, it doesn't matter how you interpret this. This is not what we wanted. This needs to be truly tax-free. But for now, I wouldn't plan on that. I wouldn't hold my breath. I wouldn't plan on doing something else with that windfall that you might have gotten because of that. I'd plan on setting some of that aside.
Now, one other thing too to mention is even if Congress reverses 180 degrees, it's still going to be state taxable.
That's right.
Because they have unhitched themselves.
Yep.
So no matter what Congress does, you're going to end up with a 5% tax bill on that money. And remember, for it to have been forgiven, you had to spend it. So it's no longer in your pocket.
Yeah.
So, it's just something for folks to realize. I fully expect that either Congress or the court someday will change that. But, IRS is not going to go wait on your tax bill for you to say, I think you're wrong. They tend to prosecute such things, as I understand, Rollin. Isn't that correct? That they don't just wait to be corrected?
They go all out for their interpretation until they're told they're wrong. So that's right.
Yeah, excellent points, gentlemen. Greatly appreciate it. We're right at the 11 o'clock hour, and we're happy to get one more question. If anyone wants to submit one on our chat side, I think we've still got some time. If not, greatly appreciate everyone being here today. If you'll notice in the chat section, I shared all of our contact information. So for those that asked about links to the previous webinar, I can email that to you. And of course, Rollin, Jamie, Derek, myself, all available to connect with resources, answer questions, etc. And we've got one more Q&A here. Let me see. Did one come through?
Tommy, they're just telling us how great we are.
Oh, hey, we love that. Well, listen,
Tommy, I do have one other one.
Okay, great.
We had one come in beforehand
Okay.
about, what's the balance between I'm dealing with a bad year right now, and I've got some stuff on my books, especially my balance sheet, that maybe just need cleaning up. Do I do that now and just take it on the chin even more, or do I wait? And I'm always of the mindset is get that thing cleaned up. If maybe you're already in a bad year, you're already in an off year, COVID's going to be blamed for a lot of stuff, rightly and maybe not so rightly. But banks, lenders, others get that. And so I'm of a mind, let's just clean up everything that we know that needs to be cleaned up. Because what you don't want is you don't want next year to be a good year and suddenly someone starts to question or challenge some of that stuff on your balance sheet. And suddenly you're forced to clean it up. And then what looked like a good year is suddenly not such a good year because you'd left some stuff on there that really should have been cleaned up in the past. So I'm a strong proponent of let's just clean that stuff up, just take it on the chin this year, wipe it all out. And definitely to our earlier comments, have good communication with your banker, with your lender, or with other lenders if you're forced into that position. Just find a good relationship there and keep that as a good relationship. Talk to your lender about that, help them understand it. Make sure they're aware. Don't do stuff and then hope you can explain it to them later. I'll tell you, bankers don't like that. None of us like that as advisors. We'd rather you come to us before you do something instead of telling us after the fact, oh, I did this last week, help me out. It might be too late. We might not be able to. So just have that upfront conversation. That'll definitely help out.
And Tommy, I think we're up for a part 3. I don't think this particular crisis is over yet.
Oh, I would definitely agree. And I think that's a great idea. And we'll definitely get it scheduled and marketed out. So let's all plan on a part 3. I agree 100%, Jamie. I think there's a lot more to come in the coming weeks. And again, thank you, Rollin, Derek, Jamie. Really appreciate y'all being here this morning. Thank you all for attending. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can help. And we'll get that PowerPoint out to everyone that came today and attended as well from Rollin as for you too. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time. Part 3.